She made a video this afternoon, and she wanted to just kind of introduce Larry that way, and
said it earlier.
I'm incredibly sorry not to be able to stay through the evening and give this award to the brilliant Larry Brilliant, pun intended. Larry Brilliant is one of the great global public health leaders of his generation. It's really hard to capture the magic of Larry in a few minutes. His whole life has been in service of better public health and improved human rights. Larry is a true polymath. If I'm asked to describe him in a sentence, I often say he's like Forrest Gump, but smart. No insult intended to Forrest Gump. Larry has literally been at every important social, political event since the 1960s. It seems unbelievable, but it's really true. He was involved in the anti-war movement. He was involved in the civil rights movement. He was involved in a few, maybe more than a few, musical events with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then he went to India. In India, Larry became a public health warrior. He found his calling. He joined, after being kicked out of his ashram by his guru, the smallpox eradication team, arguably the greatest achievement in global public health. A group of people from around the world tackled one of the biggest killers in history, a disease that in the 20th century alone killed 500 million people. Larry came back to the United States with his wife Girja, believing that the impossible should always be possible. He became a professor of international health at the University of Michigan. He founded with his wife and others the SEVA Foundation, which to this date has brought sight to tens of thousands of people. He was at the forefront of the internet, co-founding The Well, one of the first online communities. He was the first executive director of Google.org, the first president of Skull Global Threats, and in 2006 he won the TED Prize, his wish to end pandemics in his lifetime, believing again that the impossible should be possible. Which brings us to why I'm not here tonight. Because 2 years ago I said, if I could get Larry Brilliant to be the center of a film about what we all could do together to prevent epidemics in the 21st century, then I need to do that film. And 2 years ago, Larry Brilliant said yes.
Very unexpected privilege to introduce Larry to the stage to accept his award.
Zach, I hope you'll tell Janet how disappointed I was that she wasn't here and that she appeared via celluloid, because it makes it impossible for me to get even with her in a meaningful way, because there were so many things I would say in rebuttal. I want to talk to you about how important health rights are and what that means, and a little bit about how my life has crisscrossed with the phrase health rights. You know, I grew up in a time when the American Medical Association said that health care was a privilege and not a right. The president of the American Medical Association when I was growing up, Milford Rouse, I still remember his name. I still remember the AMA meeting that I went to when I watched him say that health care was not for poor people or the marginalized or the disadvantaged, but only for those who could pay for it. You think about how far we've come. And I wound up editing a magazine called Healthright News. And I want to tell you how that happened. I was a student at the University of Michigan. Go Blue! See, I knew I'd get I had one certain applause line in my speech. So I was a junior at Michigan when a little ad in the Michigan Daily said that Martin Luther King was going to come to campus. And it was a terrible day. It was the kind of day that Ann Arbor or Ithaca or New York can have. It was snow that was growing horizontally and not vertically. You could barely push up against the wind, but somehow I made it to the Rackham Auditorium, which holds 3,000 people, and about 30 people made it to see Martin Luther King. And he got up on stage and he was introduced by the president of the university. And he got up there and he saw 30 people in this cavernous hall that seated 3,000. And he looked out and just started to laugh and laugh. And he said, come on, you all come on up here. Come on up here. Come on up on stage. And we sat around him on a parquet floor for 3 hours, wrapped, as he talked about a dream of a world in which everyone was equal. You heard him say, when his little children could grow up in a world that was colorblind. And he talked about not just health rights, but civil rights and moral rights. And there wasn't one of us that was not changed forever. That summer, we went to the South to march in Selma and in Mississippi. 2 years later, when I was in medical school, I marched with Dr. King in Chicago, in New York, against the war in Vietnam for civil rights. I joined a group called the Medical Committee for Human Rights. And our job was to wear white coats and very ostentatiously dangle stethoscopes from our pocket so that we could form a phalanx around Martin Luther King so that he wouldn't get beaten up. And one day in Chicago, the police came out and they arrested all of us who were marching for civil rights. And there were 300 of us who were arrested. And this is a lesson that I've learned from my friend Wavy Gravy, who is a clown. He said, if you're going to be arrested, try to be arrested with 300 of your best friends. Because, and this is for all of you who are activists, because if you're going to be arrested alone, you go to real jail. If you're arrested with 300 people, you wind up going to pretend jail. You know, where they get some public park and they put up tents and they arrest you and folk singers come and sing and they bring you delicatessen food. I mean, that was what it was like. But I went through medical school, I did my internship, I got a job as a civil rights specialist, and I wound up in San Francisco. And the organization, Medical Committee for Human Rights, that continued working in civil rights, asked me to edit their magazine, which was called Healthright News. So that's one place in which my life has intersected with what you do. I was also a deep fan of Jonathan Mann. I worked for WHO for 10 years for the World Health Organization, and I worked on smallpox, I worked on polio, and some of our friends here, Sal Khan, who's working in Sal Ahmed, who's working, I don't know where you are, I can't see anything. Sal, where are you? And his whole family who are working in Pakistan on polio right now, as it is the last mile of polio eradication. I worked on polio and smallpox and blindness for WHO. And every time we did anything, it was Jonathan Mann who held a light that led us, a place where you could combine integrity and a feeling of commitment as well as great science. And his wife, Mary Lou Clements, who worked for me in the smallpox program, they both perished in a plane crash. And it was a great loss to this community, to the health rights community, to the civil rights community, to the HIV/AIDS community, and to the global health community. But I want you to remember, if you remember one thing from tonight, it's that working for the health of all of us is not just something else to do, along with everything else. When I was teaching epidemiology, my favorite slide that I showed to kids was a slide that had the names of 25 emperors and kings and queens who died of smallpox. Now, I didn't show that slide because I'm an anti-royalist or I take particular delight in kings and emperors dying. I showed that slide to remind us that we are all in it together. It doesn't matter how much money you have, doesn't matter how successful you've been. If there is a new pandemic, potential virus that jumps species and gets into the human population, it doesn't matter who you are or what you think you are. You have the same DNA and the same vulnerability. We are 99% the same DNA, each of us. We're in it together. And those kings and queens, they were not able to protect themselves with all the wealth that they had. And make no mistake about it, we are all vulnerable to an emerging pandemic disease, whether it's bioterror or bioerror or a new virus that jumps in or an old friend that like tuberculosis or cholera that comes back because of antibiotic resistance. This idea of health rights, and we are all in it together, is being challenged by modernity. And we, more than ever, need to focus on the poorest and the most vulnerable. And we need to put them at the front of the line. And we don't need to put them at the front of the line merely because it's good people or it's a moral necessity. It's beyond that. It's for self-preservation. If you think about where the Ebola outbreak came from, it came from the intersection of three of the poorest post-conflict countries in the world. And at their borders is where Ebola began and where it jumped into the rest of the world. And every pandemic begins in a place like that. Every threat to human health begins in a place like that. And so if it isn't enough for you to work on health rights just because it's the right thing to do, it's also in our selfish best interest. But whatever your motivation is, whether it's self-preservation or the moral certainty that health rights is critically important, you're here tonight, you're working with the best organization in the world. You should be very proud of what you're doing. You should give more money to match his grant. And I thank you very much for this. And I accept this on behalf of all the other health workers who work in the fields every day and work in your name. Thank you very much.
Well, I think as an MC, you have to be smart enough to know when to be quiet and just let the words percolate. Those were brilliant words, very moving.